If you were born between 1992 and 1996, you had Facebook in high school. Not college, not your 20s, high school. You made your profile at 13 or 14, picked a profile picture that felt like a statement about who you were, and then waited to see who you'd become online. You remember your first like. You remember checking back to see how many you had. You remember when that number mattered to you in a way you didn't fully understand yet. You went through puberty on Instagram. You watched your body change, your face change, your entire sense of who you were trying to be change. And all of it was photographed, posted, tagged, and archived on a public platform before you had the vocabulary to explain what identity even was. You know what it feels like to write a bio at 14, to choose 8 words that were supposed to explain who you were to everyone who landed on your page. You revised that bio more than you revised any school essay, because it felt more important than any school essay. You started high school with a flip phone and finished it with a smartphone. You were the first generation to be left on red before you were old enough to vote. Your friend group had a group chat before it had a regular meeting place. You watched your ex's new relationship unfold in real time, 3 taps away, on a platform you both still used because leaving felt like admitting something. Here is what nobody said clearly enough to your generation while all of that was happening. You were the first cohort in history to go through adolescence, the most psychologically fragile, identity-defining period of any human life, while the internet was watching. And psychology is only now beginning to fully document what that did. Most people fold late millennials into the broader millennial category without understanding the single most important distinction that separates them. Older millennials, born in the early to mid-1980s, got social media in college or their mid-20s. Their identities were already mostly formed. Social media became an add-on, a tool, a place they visited. It changed their habits. It didn't rebuild the architecture. Gen Z, born after 1996, grew up entirely inside social media from early childhood. They never knew anything different. The digital environment is their baseline, not a disruption. The 1992 to 1996 cohort is something specific. They were old enough to remember life before constant connectivity, summers of actual boredom, afternoons of being genuinely unreachable, the experience of not knowing what people thought of you until you saw them in person. And they were young enough that social media arrived exactly at the worst possible developmental moment, during identity formation, during the years when the most fundamental question of adolescence, who am I, and how do other people see me, is being answered for the very first time. Those two things colliding, the most vulnerable developmental window and the most public social environment ever created, produced a psychological experience with no real precedent, and the people living inside it had no map. In 1954, psychologist Leon Festinger proposed what became one of the most replicated theories in social psychology: social comparison theory, the principle that humans instinctively evaluate themselves by measuring against others. In a normal social environment, that comparison is bounded: your school, your neighborhood, your immediate peer group, organic, limited, survivable. The 1992 to 1996 cohort did not go through adolescence in a normal social environment. They went through adolescence in an environment where the comparison pool was unlimited, global, and curated, where every peer, acquaintance, and stranger was presenting the optimized version of their life: filtered photographs, selected moments, highlight reels sold as reality, where the feedback loop, likes, comments, follower counts, arrived instantly, quantifiably, publicly. Erik Erikson identified adolescence as the critical window for identity formation, the stage where a person is answering, for the first time, the question of who they fundamentally are. The 1992 to 1996 cohort answered that question under conditions of perpetual upward social comparison, constant self-presentation, and real-time public validation, or its absence. Nobody in human history had ever done that before. The conditions were new. The psychological cost was real. In 2018, psychologist Twenge and her colleagues published research in Clinical Psychological Science, tracking mental health trends in U.S. adolescents between 2010 and 2015. The numbers were stark. Rates of depression among teenagers rose by 33% over those 5 years. Teens spending 5 or more hours per day on social media were 66% more likely to carry at least one suicide risk factor than teens who spent less than 1 hour per day on the same platforms. Twenge's data identified 2012 as the inflection point, the year smartphone ownership crossed 50% among American teenagers, the year the mental health numbers began to move. For the 1992 to 1996 cohort, 2012 landed between their ages of 16 and 20. They weren't encountering social media for the first time that year. They were already years deep into building an identity inside it. What Twenge documented was the cumulative effect of a process this cohort had been living through since early high school. You were not struggling because something was wrong with you. You were navigating identity formation, the most psychologically demanding work a developing human does, inside conditions actively working against the process. The anxiety your generation carries is not a character flaw. It is the documented, measurable result of a developmental environment that was not designed with your nervous system in mind. Here is what those conditions actually built. The 1992 to 1996 cohort is the most self-aware generation in the modern psychological record. Not self-absorbed, self-aware. There is a real difference. You developed your self-concept under constant external scrutiny. You learned earlier and more thoroughly than any generation before you how to examine your own presentation, your own motivations, the gap between who you are and who you were performing. Because the platform demanded it, because there was no option not to. You know how you come across. You know when you're being genuine and when you're performing. You have been managing the gap between your private self and your public self since you were 14 years old. Most people spend decades developing that level of self-examination, if they develop it at all. You were handed it as a teenager, without asking for it, under conditions you didn't choose. You are also more resilient to public failure than you give yourself credit for, because you grew up in a world where mistakes were not private, where something that went wrong at 16 was visible, screenshotted, discussed, where you had to keep moving in public spaces through the discomfort of being seen. That kind of exposure, survived and integrated, produces a specific, hard-won toughness that people with easier adolescences simply don't carry. There is something that deserves to be said plainly about what your generation was handed without being asked. You were given a technology during the most vulnerable years of your development, given no instruction for how to use it safely, and asked to build a functional identity under conditions no previous generation had ever encountered. The adults around you were still debating whether social media was good or bad for teenagers. You were already living inside its long-term consequences. What you built in those years, the self-awareness, the emotional intelligence, the ability to hold a private self and a public self simultaneously, the fluency in the distance between authenticity and performance, cost something real. It cost you a version of adolescence that was quieter, slower, and more forgiving. It cost you the experience of making mistakes in relative private. It cost you a developmental window that, for every generation before yours, came with a certain amount of invisible protection. You were the first. Nobody knew what the first would face, because the environment itself was new, and most of you came through it having developed a kind of literacy, in identity, in perception, in self-knowledge, that no generation before you had any reason to develop. That is not a consolation prize. It is the real thing, even if the cost of learning it was higher than it ever should have been. If this described your generation more accurately than the standard millennial content, subscribe, because the next video is going somewhere your brain is already pointed after watching this one. And if this one landed, the next one will too.